The grand, mahogany-paneled courtroom stood as a symbol of authority and, for many, a place of justice. But for those who had stood before Judge Walter Sterling, it was anything but fair. The towering judge, known for his cold, piercing blue eyes and smirking indifference, had sat on the bench for over 2 decades, his name synonymous with strict rulings and veiled bias. At 62, his silver hair and crisp black robe exuded the dignity of his position, but those who knew him understood the rot beneath the surface. He wasn't overtly racist, not in a way that could be quoted in a newspaper or used in a lawsuit, but in the way his gavel always fell harder on Black and Latino defendants, in the way his smirk curled when he sentenced someone to years for minor infractions, while white offenders got second chances and leniency. He thrived on power, believing that the law bent to his interpretation rather than the other way around. Behind closed doors, Judge Sterling often mocked defendants with his colleagues. "Another one of those types, huh?" he'd remark after harshly sentencing a young black man. He never used slurs, he was too careful for that, but the undertone was always clear. His court-appointed lawyers often sensed it. But who were they to challenge a man who had connections in the highest places? Sterling believed himself to be untouchable. He had friends in law enforcement, donors in high places, and a track record that made him look tough on crime, a reputation that won him elections. But more than anything, he enjoyed the power. He relished watching people squirm, knowing that their entire lives rested in his hands. The look of despair, rage, or helplessness that flickered in the eyes of certain defendants, the ones he already saw as guilty before the trial even began, was his true satisfaction. But what Sterling didn't know was that his time on the throne was running out. The courtroom bustled as the next case was called. The stenographer adjusted her glasses, ready to type out the proceedings. The bailiff stood stiffly, his hands folded behind his back. Attorneys shuffled their notes while defendants sat nervously at their tables, awaiting judgment from the man who had already made up his mind before they even spoke. Judge Sterling entered with an air of superiority, his robe flowing behind him as he took his seat. The room fell into immediate silence, a conditioned response to his presence. He tapped his gavel lightly, more of a formality than a necessity, and peered down at the courtroom with a smirk. First up was Marcus Hill, a 26-year-old black man arrested for resisting arrest after being stopped for a broken taillight. The charge should have been a minor citation, but Sterling saw an opportunity. "So, Mr. Hill," Sterling drawled, his voice oozing condescension, "you decided to escalate a simple stop into something more dramatic?" Marcus clenched his jaw. His public defender, a young woman barely out of law school, shuffled nervously beside him. "Your Honor, my client simply." Sterling held up a hand, silencing her. "I'm sure he did. And yet here we are." His smirk deepened as he glanced at the jury, setting the stage for their perception of the defendant. Marcus's hands tightened into fists. He had seen this exact performance before, one meant to paint him as a menace, a troublemaker who had brought this upon himself. Sterling leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the courtroom. He already knew how this case would end, but he loved the process. He enjoyed watching the defense squirm, knowing that their words meant nothing in the end. "You see," he continued, his tone falsely amused, "men like Mr. Hill seem to think that if they resist long enough, the law won't catch up to them. But let me assure you, young man, the law is always watching." The prosecutor barely had to argue his case before Sterling handed down a harsh ruling. 6 months in county jail, despite the weak evidence. Sterling's smirk returned as the gavel slammed down. Another lesson delivered. Another defendant put in their place. And yet, outside the courthouse, a storm was brewing, one that Sterling never saw coming. Despite his many years of unchecked power, there were whispers, small murmurs of resistance. Court reporters noticed patterns in his rulings. Public defenders knew their clients had no chance in his courtroom. Activists had begun to take notice, quietly gathering cases, records, and testimonies. There was a particular lawyer, Damian Carter, who had been keeping track. A former public defender turned civil rights attorney, he had seen too many lives ruined by Judge Sterling's biased rulings. Carter had begun building a case, slowly and carefully, pulling records, finding patterns Sterling thought no one noticed. Sterling had dismissed Carter before, laughed off his challenges in court, called him a performer for the social justice crowd. But Carter was patient. He knew that corrupt men always slipped up eventually. And then, it happened. The one case that would change everything. Sterling's arrogance had blinded him to the cracks forming beneath his feet. He had grown careless, overconfident. When he mocked one defendant too many, when he pushed a ruling too far, he set off a chain of events that he could never undo. It was another smirk, another flippant ruling that became the tipping point. This time, someone had recorded it. This time, the world was watching. It was supposed to be just another day in Judge Walter Sterling's courtroom. Another defendant. Another harsh ruling. Another smirk. The defendant in question was Andre Wallace, a 27-year-old black father of two, accused of stealing from a convenience store, a charge he vehemently denied. The evidence was thin, relying on a grainy security camera video that barely resembled him. His public defender, overwhelmed with cases, had barely spoken to him before the trial began. Judge Sterling already had his mind made up before Wallace even took the stand. The defense attorney stood, adjusting her glasses nervously. "Your Honor, the prosecution's evidence is circumstantial at best. The surveillance footage is unclear, and Mr. Wallace has an alibi." Sterling cut her off with a wave of his hand, his lips curling into a familiar smirk. "Counselor, if I had $1 for every time I heard it wasn't me, I'd be retired on a private island by now." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, the ones who knew better than to challenge him. Wallace gritted his teeth, his hands clenching at his sides. "Your Honor, I swear I didn't." Sterling's smirk deepened. Mr. Wallace, I'm sure you have plenty of stories, but unfortunately for you, I've heard them all before." He leaned forward, staring down at him. "You should have thought about your kids before making poor life choices." A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. Wallace's public defender looked mortified. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious lawyer eager to win favor with the judge, remained silent, knowing better than to intervene. But the audience? They had seen enough. Sitting in the back row was Lana Rodriguez, an independent journalist who had been following the whispers about Judge Sterling's courtroom bias. She had been collecting stories, watching cases, and noting patterns. But now, she had video proof. Her phone, angled just right, had captured everything, from the judge's mocking tone to the blatant disregard for the defense's arguments. The smirk, the dismissal of evidence, the thinly veiled bias. It was all there, plain as day. As the gavel slammed down, sealing Wallace's fate with a 5-year prison sentence, Lana knew. This was it. The moment that would finally expose him. Within hours, Lana uploaded the unedited footage to her social media accounts. The caption was simple. "Judge Walter Sterling, is this justice?" The video exploded overnight. Civil rights groups, activists, and lawyers pounced on the case, dissecting every word, every gesture, every ruling Sterling had made in the past. This judge has been getting away with this for years. How many people has he done this to? This man's life was ruined because of a judge's smirk? This is a disgrace. What had once been whispers of bias became a public outcry for justice. Sterling's smirk, once his trademark of power, had become a symbol of his downfall. Sterling had never feared public scrutiny before. He had survived minor scandals, brushed off criticism, and had the backing of powerful allies. But this was different. His email inbox flooded with messages, from furious citizens to investigative journalists demanding answers. His phone rang nonstop, his colleagues warning him, his lawyer advising caution. And then came the worst call of all. His chief judicial officer summoning him for an emergency meeting. For the first time in decades, Judge Walter Sterling felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Judge Walter Sterling sat in his private office, his usual air of smug confidence shaken. His pristine desk, once a symbol of his untouchable authority, now felt like a barricade, separating him from the storm raging outside. His inbox was overflowing. His secretary had stopped answering calls. And worst of all, his name was everywhere. The viral video had sparked investigations into his past rulings. Legal experts were analyzing his sentencing trends, and the patterns weren't looking good. Data showed that Black and Latino defendants in his courtroom were far more likely to receive harsher sentences compared to white defendants facing similar charges. News segments replayed his smirking face, comparing it to other moments. Other cases where he had mocked defendants, dismissed valid evidence, or handed out unreasonably harsh punishments. The smirk had become a curse. Sterling slammed his fist on the desk, gritting his teeth. "This is a damn witch hunt," he muttered. His longtime friend and legal advisor, Gregory White, sat across from him, arms crossed. "Walter, you need to take this seriously. The Judicial Review Board is looking into you. This isn't just some Twitter outrage. It's escalating fast." Sterling snorted. "Let them investigate. They won't find anything illegal." Gregory sighed. "It's not just about the law, Walter. It's about perception. Your reputation is in freefall. The city's public defender's office is filing formal complaints. Civil rights groups are calling for your resignation." Sterling waved him off. "Public outrage blows over. Give it a few weeks, and they'll move on." But Gregory wasn't convinced. "You're not listening," he said, leaning forward. "Lana Rodriguez just announced that she's working with a legal watchdog group. They're going after your record, case by case." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And you know what they're going to find." For the first time, Sterling had nothing to say. While Sterling tried to ignore the growing controversy, the people weren't letting it go. Protests erupted outside the courthouse. Large crowds gathered, holding up signs with Wallace's face alongside the words. "How many more? Justice for Andre Wallace. Judges should serve justice, not their egos." Chants filled the streets, and news crews broadcasted it all live. Even within the legal community, cracks were forming. A group of local defense attorneys issued a joint statement, condemning Sterling's history of bias and judicial misconduct. Then, the biggest blow came. The state's attorney general announced a formal inquiry into his rulings. Sterling's arrogance began to waver. At home, things weren't much better. His wife, Eleanor, usually his biggest supporter, was furious. "You should have been more careful, Walter," she hissed, throwing a newspaper onto the kitchen table. The headline read, "Disgraced Judge Under Fire. A Pattern of Injustice." Sterling scowled. "I've been a judge for decades. I know what I'm doing." Eleanor crossed her arms. "Do you? Because right now, you look like a racist caricature on national television." Sterling's face darkened. "I am not a racist." She let out a bitter laugh. "Then why is it that every case they're pulling up makes you look exactly like one?" He had no answer. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. The real breaking point came 3 days later. His law clerk, Daniel, a young, ambitious lawyer who once admired him, stepped into his office with a grim expression. "Judge Sterling, I just got word." He hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "They're reopening several of your past cases." Sterling's blood ran cold. "Reopening?" His voice was sharp. "On what grounds?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Judicial bias. There's talk of appeals, possible overturned convictions. The Justice Department is reviewing whether your rulings led to wrongful incarcerations." Sterling felt the walls closing in. This wasn't just outrage anymore. This was karma knocking at his door. And it wasn't leaving. Judge Walter Sterling sat alone in his dimly lit office, the once powerful figure now a shadow of himself. His usual air of superiority was gone, replaced with something alien, a creeping sense of fear. His desk, once covered in neatly stacked case files, was now buried under legal complaints, review board notices, and formal petitions for retrials. The news hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. New revelations poured in daily. Civil rights attorneys had uncovered at least 5 wrongful convictions tied to Sterling's courtroom. One case, in particular, was especially damning. It involved a black teenager convicted of robbery, on evidence that was later proven faulty. The boy, just 17 at the time, had spent 10 years behind bars before an independent investigation revealed his innocence. And who had handed down that conviction? Sterling. The media was merciless. Judge Sterling ruined lives. Is this the justice system we trust? Unfair, biased, and dangerous, a judge's legacy in question. Lawmakers were now calling for his removal. The Judicial Review Board had officially suspended him pending further investigation. His career was collapsing. But the worst blow? He had no allies left. Sterling had spent his entire career believing himself untouchable. He thought his decisions were final, his position secure. Now, for the first time, he felt what it was like to be on the other side of the bench. No power, no control, no certainty of his future. That day, he received a summons. A formal judicial ethics hearing had been scheduled. The date? The following week. He clenched his fists. This is a witch hunt, he told himself. But a small, nagging voice whispered, Or is it justice? The hearing was broadcasted live, a public reckoning. Sterling sat before the panel, facing a room full of legal experts, activists, and former defendants who had suffered under his rulings. Lana Rodriguez was there, her presence commanding the room. One by one, witnesses testified against him. A mother whose son was imprisoned because of his unfair sentencing. A young man who lost a decade of his life behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. A law professor who presented damning statistics proving Sterling's racial bias. Sterling sat in silence, his arrogance crumbling. For the first time, he was forced to listen. The crowd watched, waiting for him to defend himself. But what could he say? How could he justify the years of injustice he had inflicted? His usual confidence was gone. Instead, his voice came out hollow when he finally spoke. I was just following the law. Lana shook her head, her voice firm. No, Judge Sterling. You were abusing it. A murmur ran through the crowd. For the first time, Walter Sterling saw himself the way the world saw him. Not as a respected judge, but as a man who had misused his power. And now, karma had arrived. The final ruling from the Judicial Ethics Committee came swiftly. Judge Walter Sterling was officially disbarred, stripped of his title, and banned from practicing law. His name, once respected, was now a cautionary tale in legal circles. The courtrooms where he had once presided no longer welcomed him. His colleagues distanced themselves. His connections vanished, and the world moved on without him. Sterling watched the news in numb disbelief as the headline scrolled across the screen. Disgraced judge removed from bench. Years of unfair rulings exposed. It was over. His legacy was shattered. In the weeks following his fall, Sterling struggled. The luxuries he once took for granted disappeared. His savings dwindled due to legal fees and civil lawsuits from those he had wrongfully sentenced. For the first time in his life, he knew financial struggle. One day, he entered a local diner, seeking a moment of peace. But the waitress recognized him. She was a black woman in her late 30s, and her eyes narrowed when she saw him. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked, voice steady. He hesitated, then shook his head. She crossed her arms. "You sentenced my brother to 5 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He was just a kid." A painful silence stretched between them. Sterling looked down at his now-worn suit, feeling smaller than he ever had before. I didn't know," he mumbled. The waitress let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't care." She turned to another server and said, "I don't serve people like him." The words hit him hard, a reflection of the prejudices he once upheld. For the first time, he felt the sting of exclusion, and it hurt. Weeks passed, and Sterling found himself at a community legal aid center. Not as a judge, not as a lawyer, but as a volunteer assistant, filing paperwork for public defenders, the same ones he once looked down on. He wasn't there by choice. The court had ordered him to complete community service as part of his sentencing for judicial misconduct. At first, he hated it. He hated being powerless, being ignored, being seen as nothing. But then, he started listening. He heard stories of people who had suffered at the hands of a justice system that saw them as less than human. And slowly, he understood. One day, he overheard a young black man speaking to a public defender. "I don't stand a chance, do I?" the young man asked. Sterling watched as the defender sighed. "We'll do our best." For the first time, Sterling realized. This wasn't about winning cases. It was about giving people hope. He sat down beside the young man. And for the first time in his life, he said something he had never imagined himself saying. "I was wrong." The young man frowned. "What?" Sterling swallowed his pride. "I used to be a judge, and I was wrong. About a lot of things. But I want to help now. If you'll let me." The young man stared at him, uncertain. But after a long pause, he nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a start. 1 year later, a local news article ran a small story. Disgraced former judge now works for justice reform. No fanfare. No redemption arc. No grand applause. Just a man who had once wielded power unfairly, now trying to undo the damage. Walter Sterling sat at his new desk, surrounded by case files. Not as a judge, not as a man of power, but as someone trying to make things right. And for the first time in his life, he knew. This was real justice.